So my name is Dan Magrath. I am the head of corporate responsibility at Gold Standard. My job is effectively centered around how can we support companies in understanding what they should be responsible for, how they should meet those responsibilities, and then trying to develop frameworks, guidance, and tools in order to support companies to be able to credibly meet those responsibilities and get the appropriate amount of recognition that they deserve for their credible actions. And we've got a really amazing panel coming up today. The way this is going to work is we're going to have a presentation for roughly 30 minutes or so from myself and my colleague Laurel. We'll then go into a panel where we have some really excellent attendees and a few pre-prepared questions for that. And then we'll go into a broader Q&A where you'll be able to ask questions. The Q&A function will come live during this presentation, so feel free to jot down your questions and your thoughts, and we'll try to get that started. Okay. I guess if we begin and people will continue to filter in as this happens. So Gary, please send us on to the next slide. Okay, so I'm sure a lot of people are thinking, what on earth is this framework and what's it about? A little over 2.5 years ago, me and my team were thinking about, we constantly have these questions about what should companies be doing, how should they be doing it? And a lot of the time where we make kind of comments or judgments on various schemes and initiatives, that they're often done from perspective of how do we think this is playing a part in a company being able to credibly act and credibly report those actions. But the thing that we felt was missing was an end-to-end viewpoint on what's the totality of what we're expecting. We have amazing institutions like the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, SBTI, CDP, and kind of a plethora of others, and they're all contributing specific parts of that journey. So what we decided to do is create a single document. Initially, it was within climate, in order to kind of encapsulate all these things into one. The whole purpose of our end-to-end frameworks is firstly tell you exactly what should a company be doing, so that we break those down into 5 principal areas. Then we say, how should you be doing that? And we list those out within activities. And then we say, on any given year, what do we think the current best practice is? And the reason why I say on any given year is we re-release this. So you can view these frameworks very much as a kind of state and trends report around what's the latest best practice, what do we think the latest best tools are. We don't just refer to gold standard things within this. There's guidance and tools from a wide variety of different NGO, civil society, and even company actors across the world. Next slide, please, Gary. So specifically, the first one we wrote was on climate, but this is our webinar on our nature responsibility framework. So very similar to what I've kind of gone through, there's the responsibility areas, there's the principles and the mechanisms all within one place. But one thing that's really quite interesting about this is within the climate space, we have a sort of pre-agreed understanding of the mitigation hierarchy and how you should be prioritizing action. That hasn't really traditionally existed within nature. So something we've tried to do within this is encapsulate what we believe the right responsibility constructs to be. Every year we're going to be re-updating this, but these are being published as a discussion paper. So as much as we're here today to talk you through what we found, what we've researched, what we think is right, you have opportunities not only today, but throughout the year to be able to feedback, challenge our thinking, let us know what you think we may be missing, things we're not hitting on enough, so on and so forth. Next slide, please. And who is this framework really for? So a lot of people is kind of the quick answer. The idea of this is to set the benchmark of what everyone should be aiming to. We acknowledge that when you read this, it's going to be very few, if any, actors today they're going to be able to do everything on all of the principles in totality. But because it's not a certification, it's not a standard, it's a framework that you can engage with completely for free. The idea then is that you can see what you need to aim towards. And so you can pick up on governance and maybe you'll be able to go further in that. And then when we talk about things like what your claims look like or how you're dealing with the impact of your operations, you can look about what you want to do there. The kind of three core people we designed this to really be used for is obviously there's corporates and companies, but also civil society and NGOs being able to engage with it, see what sort of maybe how they fit into it, but also how others do. We've had a lot of consultancies have been using our climate framework and engaging with companies to help conceptualize some of the ideas that we present, and then also, of course, governments and financial institutions. Without any further ado, I'm going to bring in my colleague Laurel, and Laura's going to introduce herself, and then she's going to take you through what the actual framework says, and then we'll get into a bit of a discussion point afterwards. So, Laurel, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. And thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. I'm Laurel Consanti-Crosby. I'm a nature officer within Gold Standard's technical team. And it's my job today to give you sort of a brief overview of the nature responsibility framework, in the hope that this kind of preview will encourage you to download it and look at it in a lot more detail. So the nature responsibility framework is split into these 5 key responsibility areas. These are kind of groupings of actions that we believe that companies need to take in order to be credible contributors to a nature positive economy. And they cover everything from capacity building, governance, assessment and disclosure, through to minimization of harm across the value chain in responsibility area 2. 3 is then focused on place-based and landscape level impacts and contributions. 4 is on systemic and global level contributions. And then lastly, 5 is on claims and communications. And so that the structure is slightly more familiar when you come to look at the document, you'll see that we have split each of these responsibility areas into a series of principles, and then that each principle is further divided into a series of areas of action. So kind of actionable steps that organizations can be taking to meet those principles. We've also provided a set of suggested implementation indicators to help you kind of track progress towards meeting that principle. And then a set of resources, as Dan mentioned. So these are things that we've either drawn inspiration from when drafting that principle, or that we feel could be helpful for an organization to help achieve that principle. So over the next few slides, I'm going to walk through each of the responsibility areas in turn. I think this might potentially give the impression that an organization's journey through the framework is this step-by-step from responsibility area 1 through 5. I think in reality, we'll find that organizations are consulting multiple different responsibility areas all at the same time, and will be delivering against different responsibility areas at the same time. But nevertheless, I will start with responsibility area 1, which is kind of a foundational principle for the responsibility areas that follow. And this is on capacity building, governance, assessment, and disclosure. So we start with a set of principles in this section on capacity building. These include things like, how do you provide training to help your staff incorporate nature into their roles and make sure that nature is a core competency within the organization. And this goes beyond, I think, just the sustainability team, and I think could include things like the finance team or buying and sourcing teams, and of course includes groups like the C-suite and the board, and how do you gain commitment for nature action from these groups. So once that kind of core capability and capacity is in place, then we have a set of principles around governance, and these include things like collaboration with affected stakeholders, how you embed nature within existing organizational policies, and also how you might go about putting in place advisory groups on advisory boards on nature to ensure that nature is included as a key factor in organizational decision making. And then we have a section on assessment and disclosure of how the organization depends on and impacts nature. This these set of principles draw a lot on the language, for example, from the Task Force for Nature-related financial disclosures, and it's thinking about kind of how and where your impacts on nature are. And then what follows that is a set of principles on target setting. So what makes a good target? How is it specific and measurable and achievable and realistic and time-bound? So once all of those principles are in place, we then move on to responsibility area 2. And this principle is titled minimization of harm across the value chain. So responsibility areas 2, 3, and 4 kind of mimic or align with the mitigation hierarchy. So this responsibility area is really focused on the avoidance and reduction of harm to nature. And that's both within a company's direct operations, but also thinking about their value chain, both upstream and downstream. And so some of the example areas of action that we've pulled out from this responsibility area include things like how do you create sustainability requirements in procurement processes? How do you work with suppliers and collaborate with them to improve practices? So, for example, how do you, if you're a company that sources food or agricultural products, how, for example, would you work with farmers to provide fair and adequate incentives to encourage a switch to, say, regenerative agricultural practices? And in the context of downstream, that could look like how do you put in place waste management systems to ensure the responsible disposal of your products. And of course, it includes direct operations, and that might have more or less of a significant role, depending on the sector in which you're operating within. But that could involve things like building facilities on sites that currently have lower ecological value. And then we move on to responsibility area 3. This is titled place-based and landscape level impacts and contributions. So whilst responsibility area 2 had a strong focus on the avoidance and reduction of harm, we see that responsibility area 3 focuses on restoration and regeneration of nature within these regions in which your company is operating in or which it sources from. And so example areas of action in this responsibility area include how you work to create or finance projects that conserve, restore, and sustainably manage nature in these high risk or key biodiversity areas that in regions where you have impacts on nature or you depend on nature heavily. And one specific approach that we've pulled out in this responsibility area is an encouragement to engage in landscape level collaborations and work on landscape approaches. So this involves how you work with other organisations and local stakeholders and government to set these shared nature goals and then work collectively to help achieve them. And then we move on to responsibility area 4. So this now zooms out even further, and this responsibility area was created in recognition of the fact that it's unlikely and it won't be enough for companies to solely focus on their direct operations and on their value chains, but there's a need to drive systemic change and make these global level contributions to, and also to engage in actions to address the drivers of biodiversity loss, be they economic or social or technological. And so some of the example areas of action that we've included in this responsibility area include things like how do you work to drive supply chain transformation for your sector? How do you participate in sector-wide efforts for systemic change? So, for example, does that involve taking part in data sharing initiatives uh, to help speed up and scale nature action, and help support organisations that are maybe earlier in their journey. We also call out the need to support policies, laws, and regulations that encourage a transition to nature positive. And then lastly, we're thinking about this sort of beyond the value chain contribution to nature restoration and regeneration. So what can companies do? Things like allocating a meaningful share of their profit towards conservation, restoration, and sustainable management of nature within, for example, biodiversity hotspots that companies aren't necessarily operating within. And then finally, we have responsibility area 5. This responsibility area is on claims and communications. It echoes a kind of similar responsibility area within the kind of sister climate framework that Gold Standard has been producing for slightly longer than we have the nature framework. But this is really about good practice around claims and communications, and the recognition that organizations that make misleading or false claims really are likely to have their credibility threatened. So we offer guidance such as things like, how do you make claims? Like, you should be making claims that are true and measurable and in good faith, that claims should be backed by data. And then lastly, a call that for organisations to publicly signal their commitment to achieving positive outcomes for nature, in the hope that this will then drive other organisations to begin their nature action journey. So that is a summary of all 5 responsibility areas that we have within the nature framework. A very brief run through. There is much, much more detail within the document itself, and I'd really encourage you to download it and look through it. We will share a QR code at the end of this webinar. It is published as a discussion paper as well, so we're always very interested to hear your feedback. And with that, I will pass back to Dan, who is going to lead us into a panel discussion, which will focus on these areas and lots more.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Okay, so the next period of this webinar is all going to be about deep diving into some of the really sort of key topics that we cover within this framework. We've got a really amazing set of panelists here. So I will be speaking to Megan Simpson from Shared Planet, who, not only being an expert in lots of these areas, was also our co-author and is someone that's kind of involved right in the weeds from the very start and did a lot of really incredible work. Tillman Silber, who is currently running fractionally late, he'll be with us very, very soon, who is the head of Net Zero Barry Callebaut, and then Julie Dimitri. I will get all of the panelists to introduce themselves as well as some of their expertise areas, and then we will get straight into it. So Megan, please lead us off with an introduction on yourself.
Thanks, Dan. So yes, as Dan said, I'm Megan. I'm a senior consultant at Shared Planet, and I also co-lead the climate and nature governance practice area at Shared Planet. Shared Planet is a small consultancy. We're based in London, and we primarily focus on issues related to the environment and specifically nature and social impact. And as Dan said, I've been working with Gold Standard pretty much for the past year, developing this nature responsibility framework. So really excited to discuss this today. Pass over to you, Dan.
Thank you. Julie, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, great. So hi, everyone. Thanks for having me today, Gold Standard and Dan. I really appreciate the opportunity. So my name is Julie Dimitrievich. I'm a senior technical specialist at Fauna and Flora, which is a conservation charity based in the UK. However, we have projects in over 40 countries globally and regional staff we have 700 regional staff in different areas around the world. We focus on conservation and restoration at the local level, enabling communities to become stewards of the land or carry forward what they're already doing by helping build capacity and providing finance for that, with the ultimate goal of letting those local entities become autonomous. However, I myself work on a cross-cutting team. So I'm on the business and nature team alongside a climate and nature team and people and nature team. And we focus on embedding nature within the strategies and objectives of companies and financial institutions. And as for myself, I'm a biologist by training. I've worked as an environmental consultant, and now I'm in the science policy interface. So really trying to push the boundaries of best practice and showing what's possible for business to integrate nature into their operations. So thank you.
Thanks so much. And Tillman, in quite frankly, the most perfect timing I think I've ever seen in any webinar. Would you please give us an introduction to both your role at Barry Callebaut and your background?
Yes, and good to be here. And sorry for the delay, which the audience apparently didn't then get really to notice. So thanks for that. So I'm Tillman. I'm head of net zero at Barry Callebaut. I have a close to 15 years career in climate and nature topics. At Barry, I'm head of net zero, meaning I'm end-to-end responsible for climate. That covers things like, reporting and audit, maybe some could say the less exciting stuff, but also then things like internal, change management, getting the roadmap into place, getting the targets set up and signed off, and a lot of B2B also work, so kind of insetting in a B2B context. In case anybody doesn't know Barry Callebaut, we are one of the, if not the world's largest chocolate manufacturer. We are quite integrated in a way that we buy from cocoa cooperatives around the world with a focus in West Africa. We then process the cocoa beans, but also manufacture the chocolate, and would then sell the chocolate on to your beloved brands, be it by some of the big houses like Nestle, Mondelez, like Cadbury, but also smaller, down to even restaurants and hotel chains.
Wonderful, thanks so much. For those that joined after my initial introduction, to reintroduce myself, my name is Dan Magrath. I am the head of corporate responsibility at Gold Standard and responsible for all things what should companies be responsible for, how should they meet those responsibilities, and what do we as Gold Standard believe the best practice action tools and guidance in order to meet those actions and satisfy those core responsibilities. Going straight into our questions, Megan, start with you as our co-author to this really big document. There's a lot of different things in there, and when a company is looking to become a positive actor, it can take a lot of time. So what are the things that companies should start with, and what's a tangible thing that companies and people in the audience could take away as their sort of their cornerstone and their beginning point?
Thanks, Dan. So I'm assuming since everyone's attending this webinar, there's already some willingness on your part and the part of your company. So I think once that willingness is established, I think the first step is gaining some base level understanding of your impact and dependency on nature. And from there, you can really start taking meaningful action. I think without that step, there's a risk that the company action that you're taking might be limited in its impact, or you could have more impactful impact if you knew kind of where the impact and dependencies lie. Or you could be making claims that are misleading. So I think having that base level knowledge is really important. And that sounds like an easy step, but it's actually really difficult, or it can be really difficult. It really needs to be rooted in some kind of evidence-led tool or methodology. And I know there's a lot of tools out there. We were very lucky to have a bunch of reviewers point us to some of those tools. But I'd say choosing the right tool and having the right level of information, and particularly the right granularity of information, might be really challenging or overwhelming. Those tools and some of the methodologies require a certain level of information. And I would really emphasize that just because there isn't a lack, if you don't have perfect information, that should not be a bottleneck for action. I think this step really is about just getting a base level so that you know where to start. And we've really structured the responsibility areas so that companies can decide where they have the most impact and then prioritize action within those responsibility areas based on their level of impact. So having that base level of knowledge, then you can kind of prioritize action accordingly. I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you. Yeah, I think this this idea of not letting perfect be the enemy of good, and really a good start is just simply starting and figuring things out moving forwards. Julie, you do a lot of work in terms of supporting businesses at really integrating nature into their business strategies. So could you tell us a little bit about how companies can start to do that, and maybe what the role of things like transition risk play in that journey?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. And I think I'll build on what Megan has already started to say. So when I first thought about this question, I'm a technical specialist, so I think very much about the company's relationship with nature. So how can they identify their impacts and dependencies across their entire value chain? And there are tools to get you started in that journey rather easily without quantified data. So you can use things like Encore, which identifies your material impacts depending on your sector and kind of the products that you're producing. So you want to think about your sites, your areas of operation. Where do you own and operate the asset? How does nature play in there? Often it's water and energy use. You have a land use footprint. And then you want to think about your supply chain. So what materials are you purchasing to create your products and run your business? And that could be food and beverage products, that can be mined minerals that are mined, different things like that. And it's thinking about the scale of impact. That helps you with prioritization. Where should I start? Should I focus on my sites? Should I focus on my supply chains? And then you want to build the business case internally and take that to your C-suite executives. Not an easy task. I work on this quite substantially. And especially in today's geopolitical climate, we need to understand, why is this important for your business? Right now, we're seeing risks. The risk opportunity lens is the biggest driver. So understanding material risks based off of your impacts and dependencies, and then turning those into opportunities. How can you make sure that you're remaining viable as a company? And that leads us into these transition risks, as you're talking about, which is quite a tricky balance to play. We recognize companies are needing to understand what are the upcoming regulatory drivers for understanding nature, which have been shifting. We were seeing quite a bit of momentum since 2022. In the EU, that's remaining, but standards are constantly being modified. And then we also have to maintain an understanding of consumer expectation. So what is the purpose and mission of your company and the products that you sell? If you want to be a sustainable enterprise and ensure viability for yourself, but also for your products, then you want to be able to back up your statements with scientifically robust methods. And the framework is a great way to start that. So the other thing I would say that is really helpful in getting started on nature is collaboration. So no one can understand everything. We all have bits of knowledge here and there, our various expertise. So if you're wanting to get started on nature, you need to develop that internal buy-in, but you also need to have external expertise to come and support your journey. So that could be consultancies or NGOs like myself and Megan. You can work with your competitors and your peers within your sector to drive best practice changes and change the regulatory expectations, and different various groups. And I think if you have all those pieces of the puzzle working together, then it becomes a lot easier to identify solutions. So I'll leave it there.
Amazing, thank you. Tillman, I guess as our kind of representative from a business that's doing the actual work itself, there's a really common narrative that's kind of, lots of businesses would like to do good things, but ultimately you've got to get the buy-in internally. And Barry Callebaut is a company that's successfully done that. So when you're kind of in your internal day-to-day role, what are the sort of things that you think about in terms of getting that internal business case?
Yeah, we did. I think Barry has been quite a front runner over the years, but also we need to continuously reprove, right? And it's not necessarily an easy time with the ESG backlash, and particularly in the cocoa sector, where there's been quite some market turmoil in the past year. So business case, obviously, whenever you work in or with corporate, is super, super important. So I tend to think about it as kind of the external and the internal business case. External is really where other groups of stakeholders hold you to account and they request you to act on something. So for us as a B2B, most important are our customers, driven by consumers, but then regulatory has been very important and is still very important. Let's see what comes out of Omnibus, obviously. It could also be other ones. It could be investors, obviously. It could be also the own employees. So that's, and so in that sense, really our internal ability to make a business case is really linked to the wider, societal economic and political situation context out there. So the higher that pressure, the easier it is for internally to say, guys, let's act. It's very clear. It's expected. Let's do it. In the easiest case, you can just say, well, it's our license to operate. And if it's out there and it's in the media and they get the pressure and the engagement maybe from investors, then it makes it very easy. With climate, for many companies, it has been the case a couple of years back that it was, a very clear and easy decision to engage. It has weakened somewhat a bit the trend, but it still, continues to be around this accountability. But on the other hand side, in the case of this, more polarized world and more ESG backlash, etc., what is currently become more important is kind of internal business case, which essentially is, what are you doing if nobody's watching, in a way, right? So if you were the only company in the world, if nobody else, none of the external stakeholders had any power over you or any influence on you, what does still make sense? And there is a lot of things, particularly around, I think, around climate adaptation, not so much the mitigation per se. There are a lot of overlaps between the two, but it's really more mitigation. You could actually summarize all of that under resilience, right? So it's an element of climate adaptation. There are elements of freshwater availability, which has to do with having enough forest in your watershed, among many other things. Question of biodiversity: can it help you to maintain certain pests? For example, swollen shoot is a very important pest and disease in the cocoa sector. So that internal business case is becoming, under the resilience flag, is becoming a lot more important lately. So that helps us to maintain the ambition very high, but at the same time, it also triggers some additional questions, right? So, for example, we are working with smallholders. They don't belong to us, obviously. They're own businessmen. So, what if if investing in a smallholder farmer and the cooperative that he belongs to be better protected to cope with the next heat wave through agroforestry, for example? Will he then also sell to us? Or if another of his customers comes over and just waves a bit with a bill, will he not sell to that one? I mean, we're operating often very cash constrained markets, so spoiler, it's not straightforward. But I'm just saying there are more kind of new kind of questions and challenges come up as you're working on this internal business case. But I think they're all solvable, and it's still a very important thing that's right now entering. It's not the only thing is entering center stage. I like to always say the external accountability has been almost the only game in town. Now the internal is like right up there, and we have two drivers of the business case.
Maybe to just build off that, I think you've mentioned within your answer these ideas of kind of adaptations. You spoke a little bit about mitigation, and then the fact that when you're communicating with these smallholders, it's got to make sense for them. It's not simply they're not sort of trying to help you meet your SDG markers per se. They've got real businesses they need to run for their own reasons. In terms of the companies that maybe they've started the climate journey or maybe they've started the nature journey, but they're yet to do both of them. Maybe first with you and then Julie, maybe to come to you afterwards. How would you recommend people approach at starting their nature journey if they've currently started the climate, but they've not yet started their nature, or vice versa?
So I would say let's start with a business case, and that correlates quite strongly with the impact, but not always fully, right? And I think that's a nuance that's quite important to think about. So when you do maybe your impact assessment, it's not enough to stay there. You also have to ask, okay, how does that translate into material financial risks? Or if you're playing more the external business case, okay, what is the external pressure to hold me to that? So it could be that there's some impact, which unfortunately in certain areas might just not be on the radar of stakeholders. Maybe something around water pollution or so. It's not a very big topic in cocoa, to be honest, but there could be things which are just they might be looking good looking important from a scientific impact perspective, but it's just not yet on the stakeholder side. And actually for you, because of downstream water, it's not really a very immediate risk. So I think I would really start on that. Obviously, you need to take a big approach, end to end, look into where are your hotspots in terms of impacts. Both ways, we talked about that, the dependencies, right? For the internal risk driver, the risk rather of like your dependency on nature is more important almost than what is your impact on the pages, or more the other side of the double materiality. And start from there and and identify synergies as much as possible. So identify measures that can pay into different elements of the business case.
Amazing. And Julie, your role is quite literally centered around getting companies to really sort of start to think about that nature journey. So maybe it's kind of more of a broad strokes approach. What are some of the some of the things that you've seen?
Yeah, so I think most often is the case. We have companies who have been thinking about climate. They're aware that nature is on the table, playing table now in terms of building a business strategy where we've always had nature involved in our business, but maybe it hasn't been recognized so officially. And often the challenge is saying we're trying to do so much for climate, we've put so many resources in there, and now we have to do something for nature. How can we find efficiencies in doing that? And often where we like to start the conversation is saying you're probably already doing things for nature and you just aren't identifying them. So really it's taking a holistic picture of what you're doing to mitigate your impacts and dependencies and think about climate in addition to natural capital. So thinking about water, air, soil, and then try to bring in that biodiversity lens, which is more nuanced and I think a little bit more technical, which is where expertise becomes really important. So that's thinking about habitats and species. We often call them ecosystems and species. And as part of the new reporting directive within the EU, you're being asked to think about how do you impact species and ecosystems? How can you restore them? And you want to think at a landscape level, you want to think holistically. It's quite overwhelming, but you're probably already doing something. And then the way to package that and to identify efficient solutions is to think about co-benefits and trade-offs. And so if you're trying to identify climate mitigation or adaptation projects, such as nature-based solutions, which are mentioned in the framework, you want to think about where am I going to put these place-based projects and how will I positively benefit climate and nature? We know the twin crises, as we often refer to, climate change and nature loss, are interlinked. And you can't solve one without solving the other, and vice versa. You can't meet your targets without meeting your other target, or without thinking about nature if you already have a climate ambition. And so to get action out of ambition, it's very important that you set targets that tie in nature into climate. So you can either embed nature criteria into your climate targets. You can have nature targets at the same place as your climate targets. And as we've been talking about, you need to think about your business case. So hopefully that makes sense. It's a bit of holistic thinking and trying to wrap things together and bring different expertise within your organization and your collaboration through partnerships together to find solutions.
Amazing. So I guess like maybe two of the key points there is one around when you think about your business case, think about all of the impacts you can have. And Julie, very much from, I think one of your core points was around you're probably already having impact on things. You might as well make sure you're really taking account of those. I think with the sort of the idea of accountability, and we've seen a huge growth within civil society of companies trying to do more and take more. And I know that the SBTI, for example, despite all of the sort of media coverage of intent around climate and nature dropping, the SBTI alone has grown by a third in the last 12 months. Up to now, 10,000 companies have attempting or already have validated targets. With that real growth in companies that are demonstrating to make their accountability known and seen, Megan, it'd be great to get a bit of an insight from you from the research you did as part of our framework, but also the work you've done with others like WWF on what's the role that governance and meaningful engagement play in that responsibility.
Thanks, Dan. So kind of building off what's already been said, attributing responsibility or attributing accountability for impacts on nature is really difficult, especially when you're looking at things like habitat loss or species loss, and trying to determine who's responsible for that is really hard. And we're all operating within ecosystems and landscapes. So I think the most effective action tends to be collective action, and with collective action requires governance and engagement mechanisms. The hardest thing, I think, for collective action is determining how to allocate resources and responsibilities among the actors that are contributing to that action, and then who should be involved in the decision making and who has the final say in decision making. And all of that comes with the need for ways in which different stakeholders can come together and engage in a respectful way and in ways that think about power dynamics. I think in terms of kind of an added part of that is really thinking about not just the corporates or the big players in that landscape, but thinking about local communities and Indigenous communities that often hold specific rights to the land. I think things like consultation, free, prior, and informed consent is often a legal right, but something that's maybe overlooked is that these communities tend to have important localized knowledge of nature, and they provide important insight into how a company or an organization is impacting nature and what needs to change. So there's a real opportunity there for them to be involved. And I think organizations can think about mechanisms like advisory boards or ways that kind of even the playing fields and create co-benefits between all the stakeholders to get involved in these types of actions. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you. I think there's a really, really key point around the kind of the idea of you need to engage in a respectful way, but it's also really not tokenistic. There's a lot you can really gain from that kind of that engagement with people that really understand sort of the way that things work and the fact that things are different in different areas and you need to be respectful for those nuances. With maybe some of that in mind about like regional specificity, Julie, we can't really talk about nature impact without considering place-based and things like landscape levels. So in terms of site-based or landscapes, how does that tie into broader global societal goals? So not only things like kind of the reportable metrics, but also other SDGs and things like the Global Biodiversity Framework.
Yeah, great question. And I think it builds really well from what Megan has been talking about. So when we think about company objectives and, goals for nature, we often are asked, how can we tie those into either regional, national goals, and then you have global societal goals. So we often refer to the Global Biodiversity Framework, which was signed in 2022. It provides 23 targets to restore nature to the way it was, with a end goal of trying to achieve this by 2050. And what's come out of this is this nature positive narrative, which is what the framework is centered around. And the idea is that we want to restore nature above and beyond what it was before 1970, as we've seen a demise in the state of nature. But as Megan mentioned, to do this, we really have to think about the users of the landscape. And what I love about nature positive ambition, whether or not you enjoy a new term to wrap your head around, is that it's really getting companies to think outside of their sites and into the landscapes and how they depend on the ecosystem services provided by nature. And as Megan said, accountability and allocation of responsibility in terms of impacts, and also how do you allocate positive benefits is very difficult. And we're working towards trying to quantify that, but we also know we need to take action now. And what we're seeing is companies coming together, bringing multiple stakeholders within a landscape. So you could have freshwater users in the same river, as an example, trying to restore a watershed. This is happening now through things like the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures Framework, Science-Based Targets Network. It's asking you to come up with landscape level objectives that can be tied to these societal goals. So we're all working together towards the same mission because we can't solve this in isolation. And what's equally important is when we're deciding how do we restore a landscape, what should it look like in future? Those who fund often don't live in those landscapes. So we need to ensure that the local communities and Indigenous people are brought into those conversations. And so we have a holistic picture of all users of the landscape. And that's where governance structures become really important. And that's what we're all working on. And I'm working on these projects with financial institutions looking to fund landscape level projects through their clients. I'm looking at it from users of the landscape who, you have people making food and beverage products who want to ensure resilience within that. So I think by working towards these common goals, it gives us a framework to work within and kind of identify what's possible.
Great. Tillman, I guess a lot of things we've spoken about have been around the kind of the theoretical in terms of how do we go about these things, how do we build a business case, what are the important parts. Maybe the sort of next major step is for a company like yours that's huge and you have impacts in so many different areas and kind of the opportunities are almost endless in terms of reach, how do you actually go about prioritizing once you've achieved buy-in and once you've got your structures in place? How do you where do you start in going, okay, this is the thing we want to focus on first, and maybe this is how we want to grow?
So I think that's an overlap between the business case that we talked about, right, with everything that comes with it, impact, and then how does it translate into your own resilience? Are you held accountable for that impact? And then the other side is probably more, if we're speaking more about operations, it's just, feasibility. And that comes, for example, with a certain scale. So in our case, we are compared to the branded, our customers, the branded food ones, we are in a way in a privileged position because we're more upstream, we're closer to the farmer, we directly buy from them. In a way, you're also privileged to some of our peers, which have a huge range of different commodities, whereas for us, cocoa is by far the number one and most important. And in West Africa is very important. So for us, that made it very easy in a way to say, okay, we'll know Ivory Coast, Ghana, those are super important ones. And we've built over the years, we've built a very significant sustainability operational footprint in these countries to really achieve the impact on the ground that we were looking for. That was a decision of the business case there, the exposure, and then the feasibility that also came with that kind of scale. Other companies probably don't have those privileges to be able to build up sustainable workforce on the ground. I think then obviously it's more about where can you work with partners, be it your suppliers that are very that might be more or less capable to do that, to deliver that, or be it external like NGOs. But I really just wanted to shed light on this kind of feasibility angle. So the market for partners, professional, high integrity, high quality partners in the field to deliver the impact on the ground is unfortunately not yet perfect. So that element of so there is an element of where really can I have an impact because I know there is a good partner and I can trust that partner and I can invest in that partnership and upscale it.
I think you also hit on a really interesting point there around maybe people like myself in civil society can be guilty of so kind of desperate to see these grand transformational changes that sometimes we forget it's really quite difficult to do. Companies are spending a lot of money really trying to do these things. So maybe as a bit of an impromptu follow-up, if you were to set a challenge to maybe people like me or other civil society about what they could do to add the most amount of value to supporting companies in these kind of endeavors, what would it be?
That's off script now. No,
that is off script.
Very good, very good. No, look, I think there are two elements that you can, that people in society can do. I think one is really accountability, right? It did make, obviously we're all individuals, and as individuals, if you go to the street or the way you vote, the way you express your interest doesn't have a limited effect, but then it sums up. So Friday for the Future, I did, some interviews with some companies in the sector a while back, and some people that have been working for decades in sustainability said it did never really make a big difference until Fridays for the Future came along. That was really, very sensible for the boardrooms of very big companies, and those were, citizens going to the street and expressing their voices and their concerns. And then obviously the other is the way you consume, right? That really sets a very strong signal. And we're all also consumers. We know that, we're not just buying according to, sometimes we're lacking information, right? It's not easy to bring that to a supermarket shelf. What is really better? I'm sometimes getting asked, which chocolate would you buy? I don't always find it easy to answer. Please don't follow up on that one. But it does have a difference, and consumers are at the end of the whole value chain. And that's something where we have to make good decisions. Sometimes it's paying more. Sometimes it's also maybe not buying something or less of something that we know has not a very good environmental impact.
I like that. It feels like a very tangible thing that anyone irrelevant to your role can take away, is that ability to A, apply accountability, but B, understand the influence that our individual purchasing choices actually make. Megan, maybe to kind of go into a bit of a deep dive in what some of the things in the framework say. We've spoken a little bit about companies that have started their climate journey, but they're nervous about their nature one. There's an obvious thing here that these two things aren't actually separate journeys, and I think we've spoken about that topic a little bit. Where's maybe some of the examples where they actually do overlap, and how can companies look to maybe start there as they're kind of dipping their toes into an entire new theme?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the biggest when we were having early discussions was in the nature responsibility framework was recognizing that a lot of businesses have started thinking about managing their climate risks, meeting climate targets. Like Julie said, maybe the nature side is happening but a bit overlooked. And as we have discussed, it's deeply interlinked and mutually reinforcing. So I guess to answer the question, I think finding those synergies, and I know that's kind of also quite a generic way of putting it, but it kind of starts with the conversations that you're having and going back to collaboration. I think having kind of siloed departments or a nature person and a climate person or one sustainability person, that can't do it all and doesn't know everything. Even when we were writing the nature framework, it wasn't until we received all of this expert feedback that I realized there were actually quite a lot of blind spots that I had when I was writing it, or I'd overlooked certain things around the impacts downstream that didn't have enough emphasis. So I think there's so many things to think about from climate and nature that if you're not bringing in people having those kind of joint conversations or joined up thinking, it will be so easy to create a climate and nature framework separately or together that overlook a core part of the problem. So I don't know if that answered your question because I kind of got off track, but I think predominantly it's about having kind of collaborative spaces that bring in different perspectives and able to not just climate and nature actually, but also have the people side of things as well and make sure that the kind of human rights, social safeguards are there when we're taking action as well.
No, I think that's a great answer. And I think one of the things that we say in the framework is this idea that if you want to be like a really leading company and be really, really ambitious, having these kind of sustainability KPIs in senior leaders sort of annual KPIs is really effective because it means that companies are excellent at finding synergies. That's what all good and big companies do every single day. And sometimes I think one of those clever ideas we can have is actually not reinventing the wheel, but sort of setting the context and then allowing companies to do what they do, which is they innovate, they can grow things, and hopefully we can help them sort of really contextualize that within those synergies where they're possible. And maybe starting with Julie and then going around to all the panelists, making sure that we everyone walks away with some very practical advice on top of the wonderful answers we already have. What advice would you have for someone in our audience who is still very early in their journey? And that might be someone that's in the company, but maybe it's not. Maybe it's someone who's working at a consultancy, who's working with a lot of companies, would like to help them, but they're currently struggling. And maybe just a quick thing that if anyone has any questions in the audience, please do put those in the chat and we'll come to you after this round of questions.
Yeah, perfect. So I think we've chatted a lot about practical solutions. So to reiterate, I do really agree with Megan. I think collaboration is key, bringing in key people. But if you are one of those sole sustainability people, you have a lot of responsibility on your shoulders. We see you, we know you're there. There are many of you who exist. So I think trying to think about the business case for nature is really important. It's not a question of if nature is embedded in your business, it's how. And there are tools to get you started on that journey. I've mentioned Encore. That's just simple dashboard click, find things of what the material impacts are of the supply chains that you have. There's the WWF risk filter. You can put point location data into the dashboard and it will give you, there's 100 data layers in there to tell you different risks from water, soil, geopolitical risk, biodiversity loss, all sorts of things. If that's too technical, then try to identify some partners who can work through that and think about your value chain operations and where you might want to focus, and then bring that forward to your board and try to have those conversations, which is not necessarily easy. But I think we need to move away from this conversation of nature is important for nature's sake. It's actually nature is important for business. And there are financial repercussions if we don't think about this now. And trying to identify what those are can have a really powerful impact internally to bring that forward to the entire organization. So hopefully that's helpful.
I like it. I feel that's very quotable, that nature is not only important for nature's sake, it's important for business. I feel like something we can put on a tagline somewhere. Tillman, straight over to you.
So I would say, so by training, I'm an ecologist actually. And I remember that during my studies, I sometimes looked at situations that were not ecologically kind of perfect. And from an ecologist's perspective, you just scratch your head and think about why is it this way? It just doesn't make any sense. Very naively, right? I can say that was very naive. So if you turn it around, I think the advice to my younger myself, me, and then maybe that's also helpful for others earlier in their journey, it would be, really invest enough time to understand the kind of other side, which maybe doesn't come from our bubble of, ecologists and people that want to save the world. So what is it both in terms of, in terms of the corporate context? It's super important that we as corporate sustainability professionals understand what is, the business, sometimes called the business necessities, in order to then challenge them and say, okay, as you just said, right, look, if you're thinking a bit ahead, a bit longer time horizon than you maybe have, and you think about certain risks that are not just coming up, climate's changing now. It hasn't been, we've never had such a hot average temperature in the last decades like now. So it's happening now. So the new things that you have to take into account if you want to be a good businessman. So these kind of things, right? But you first have to understand their perspective, both on a corporate level, but I think quite often also on a local level. Right? If you're working on a certain site-specific project, the situation is not ideal, and it is that like that for a certain reason. So why is that? Who are the stakeholders? What are they after? What are their needs? What are things where maybe we have some potential to change them? That's super important. And then in the end, it comes down to also a sense of humility. So we all want to save the world. None of us will be able to save the world, at least not by themselves, at least not in full. So, but still appreciate and acknowledge the small impact that we can have, no matter where we sit in corporates, outside, in NGOs, as consumers, as people on the street, etc.
Amazing. I like that no one can do it all on their own, but everyone can play a part. And I think that's quite a nice, again, lots of taglines coming out of this. Megan, over to you.
Thank you. I actually didn't prepare an answer to this question because I kind of wanted to absorb what other people were saying and think about it as I went along. And I think just building off what Julie and Tillman both just said, I guess what I was thinking about was every sector has their own language when they're talking about these crises, and it can get quite confusing. I predominantly actually work with NGOs. So I think I understand the NGO language a little bit better than I do the corporate language around impact, dependencies, opportunities, and risks. But I think kind of speaking to what Tillman said, understanding each other's language and trying to find those shared perspectives of where we're all trying to make or mobilize action and not to get so siloed in our specific thinking. And I think we've talked a lot about the business case, and it's important, and framing it in business terms definitely will get buy-in from the business people that you need to get buy-in, but it might not get buy-in from consumers or might not get buy-in from NGOs or local actors, like Tillman said. So it really is like a survival thing, or not to get too meta and scary, but we all need to take action as humans, and businesses are a big part of that. So I think trying to bring that joined up thinking and language when we're communicating with the people and the different stakeholders that we are. I guess it's the same thing that Julie and Tillman said, but I liked how you said
it. Amazing. And maybe to throw in as a chair's prerogative my own view, I guess 3 things for me. For NGOs, I think keep it simple. We often forget that sometimes sustainability teams are one person. Other times they're lots of people, but the reality is the people that are consuming the information that are really important are often consumers, and they don't have the luxury of being able to look into lots of the kind of technical aspects of this. So keeping it simple is good. For companies, I would always recommend, in my experience, if you are able to be honest and transparent, even when things go wrong, people are very open to being very lenient around making mistakes. generally people don't like to feel like they've been misled. And misleading generally, in my experience, companies don't often do that intentionally. It's by not publicly communicating the things that maybe they accidentally missed out, or they understood new information that changed what some of their original statements were. And finally, of course, please download our Nature Framework. It is a great place to start, and my comms team would be remiss if I didn't phrase it as that. I will very quickly check to see if we have any questions, but I don't think we do, in which case we will have run this to almost perfectly an hour, which is fantastically satisfying from a timekeeping perspective. So I will simply say thank you so much to our panelists. Gary, if you'd just like to put the slide on so that we can have the QR code for the Nature Framework. It is available to download now. It has within it an ability to provide comments and feedback, any thoughts you may have, be that positive, be that challenges. Please feel free to send those directly to us. And in terms of our climate framework, the third version of it will be being published in the next 10 days ahead of New York Climate Week. So please keep your eyes and ears out for that. And I'd like to say a special thank you to all of our panelists, my colleague Laurel for her wonderful explanations. And thank you all for joining. Have a wonderful rest of your days and look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Dan and crew. Thank you.